Hi everyone. Today we'll be doing one thing and one thing only, which is reading my current essay, Slurs Aren't Activism. But before we get to that, a little bit about me. My name's Persephone Vanderwaard. I have my MA in Gothic English Literature and independent PhD in Gothic Poetics and Little Gothic BDSM, focusing partially on Metroidvania, and I am the author of the multi-volume non-profit book series Sex Positivity, its art director, sole invigilator, illustrator, and primary editor, the other co-editor being Bay Ryan. I am a male-to-female trans woman, Tolkien and Amazon enthusiast, anti-fascist, atheist, and Satanist, polypan kinkster, erotic artist, pornographer, and anarcho-communist. Originally, this blog explored my love of movies when I was cishet. Now I use it to write about the gothic, horror, but also sex, heavy metal, and video games in a queer way, especially Metroidvania. You can financially support my blog through Ko-fi or Patreon. One is safe for work, and the other is not safe for work, but the money for either goes towards the same art and essays I produce, which often complement each other. Also, before we start reading, I just want to say that while this is effectively me reading from a script, an essay is basically a script as far as I'm concerned, and we're reading it from top to bottom, there will occasionally be times where I make small mistakes. I have practiced reading this multiple times, so hopefully those mistakes will be small, but I will make them occasionally. We will also pause from time to time to read footnotes, go over visual aids, and make various clarifications when needed. With that out of the way, let's get started. This essay, Slurs Aren't Activism, was written to critique Natalie Wynn, aka Contrapoints, for her liberal Zionism, but also ableist critics like Bad Empanada calling her narcissist, affecting myself and my friends, i.e. being trans and or mentally ill, including having various mental disorders. It remains part of my sex positivity series, albeit coming from outside the books themselves, i.e. belonging to a disparate body of essays and interviews that fall under the same basic umbrella, but often will engage with more than the usual suspects, tokenism, but also bigoted allies. Disclaimer regarding essay contents. This essay is non-profit and provided for purposes of education, critique, and satire, i.e. as a matter of professional opinion against multiple other public figures and publicly available material during times of state crisis. Content warning: classism, racism, sexual assault, transphobia, Zionism, ableism, and genocide. Slurs Aren't Activism, critiquing Natalie Wynn's Zionism and her critics calling her narcissist. People who talk about sex constantly and openly like it's their main interest must be dealt with. Make it taboo again. BDSM doctor, that's not a real thing. Jesus fucking Christ. Bad Empanada in a 2024 community post. A variety of people have responded to Contrapoints, aka Natalie Wynn, i.e. to her terrible breaking of silence 4 days ago, but also 20 plus months into the Palestinian genocide, only to defend the two-state solution, while calling anti-Zionist activism a lost cause, specifically on the left, for punching up at Biden and Trump's funding of said genocide. The irony and hypocrisy here is off the charts, below. I want to respond to Wynn herself, but also critics of Wynn, namely those calling her a narcissist, i.e. in ways that, whether those who use this slur mean to or not, or however tempting it may be to use it in its harmful colloquial sense, are doing so all the same while harming their own arguments, e.g. Bad Empanada, someone I've criticized in the past for their own bigotry, despite their valid post-colonial stances, calling Wynn a narcissist to shoot his argument in the foot. Contrapoints, Zionist narcissism personified. Slurs are bad and only contribute to genocide when used by those who can't reclaim them, e.g. calling Hitler the N-word when you're not black to critique genocide only furthers genocide. Zionism is wrong, but slurs aren't activism nor a diagnosis. Bad Empanada. We'll get to that. First, let's consider the many responses to Win. In response to Win's hateful, self-important screed denying genocide, critics on the left responded with rage, and quite validly. Win's a sellout for the establishment and has been for years, whitewashing genocide when this was her moment to, if not shine. She's kept quiet for too long to do that, then at least save face. Instead, she stonewalls, making me think of a Frank Zappa quote that feels all too relevant. At the point where the illusion becomes too expensive to maintain, they will just take down the scenery, they will pull back the curtains, they will move the tables and chairs out of the way, and you will see the brick wall at the back of the theater. It's better to have something to remember than anything to regret. In other words, it's better to dismantle bigotry productively than contribute to Butler's gender trouble during multiple genocides, i.e., Palestine is one genocide, and the trans problem is another. You don't prevent them by using slurs in a bigoted way. Furthermore, if the Palestinian question requires American pushback to prevent, then I fail to see how punching down at GNC people and disabled folk, some of the more marginalized people in America, helps your case. I.e., we fags are just so self-centered, didn't you know? And if that were true, calling us names that dehumanize us won't be very persuasive. Instead, it's coercive. This effect, and its praxial inertia, certainly isn't helped by Win, but also, as we'll see, those calling her narcissist, i.e. while failing to consider how doing so against one member of a group applies by virtue of collective identity and punishment to other members, regardless of intent on either side, e.g., I don't even like Win, but am mentally ill, neurodivergent, and trans. Likewise, attacking a mentally ill, neurodivergent person who just so happens to be trans, with language historically used to belittle the larger group, will sour your larger point by making you look bigoted, re like Bad Empanada does. Doing so for rebellious purposes, no different, functionally, than the R-slur, psycho, or similar words with long-standing histories of abuse between them. Slurs are wrong, and they historically don't work save to divide labor, which the elite want. Even if you get our attention, it only sows ill will between comrades and contributes to mentalities of animosity that only serve to demonize and divide. You are doing the state's work for it. Don't. I digress. Win's stubbornness and privilege currently have many people acknowledging her own bigotry through direct responses. Dead Domains, What the fuck, Contrapoints? Rathbone's Contrapoints defend Zionism. I Am Blakely's Is Contrapoints a Zionist? Hassan Abi's Why Did She Post This? Who acts surprised about Win showing his own white straight privilege. Elliot Sang-Again's BreadTube is Over. Mike from PA's Debunking Contrapoint's Disgraceful Statement. And Turb 2's Cracker Point's Genocidal Crashout. But also essays like Overzealots, Palestinians Rejected Every Peace Offer, An Outright Lie, and Bad Empanada's aforementioned Zionist Narcissism, due to a recent health scare, re Joy Under Fascism. I haven't had time to directly respond myself, but have acknowledged genocide denial from online communities before, re Hot Carl. I said denial happening despite increasing transparency surrounding it, versus the tactical solidarity seen during Vietnam, where information on the war was televised but not as accessible as the internet, or even World War II in Nazi Germany, where information was more limited, to the point that many Germans didn't know the Holocaust was going on. To it, Win is very much playing dumb, a left-wing Zionist defending American dominion through a false equivalency, comparing Israel, an American puppet state, to America during 9/11, all while ignoring the neocon peace through strength approach, envisioned first by Theodore Herzl, theorized by Jabotinsky's Iron Wall argument, and finally put into practice by David Ben-Gurion and his successors through the IDF and Nakba onwards. See Overzealots, Left-Wing Zionism, How to Sell an Ethno-State. In doing so, she purposefully neglects the reality that America and 9/11 were conducted by an imperial mother country versus Israel acting as a puppet state with American backing. These are two very different things when making all the usual arguments defending U.S. hegemony while also exonerating Israel as much as possible, and in fact comparable to Philosophy Tube's own betrayal of the Palestinians. Footnote number 1, Jabotinsky's Iron Wall argument. We cannot promise any reward either to the Arabs of Palestine or to the Arabs outside Palestine. A voluntary agreement is unattainable, and so those who regard an accord with the Arabs as an indispensable condition of Zionism must admit to themselves today that this condition cannot be attained, and hence that we must give up Zionism. We must either suspend our settlement efforts or continue them without paying attention to the mood of the natives. Settlement can thus develop under the protection of a force that is not dependent on the local population, behind an iron wall which they will be powerless to break down. Footnote number 2, regarding Israel acting as a puppet state with American backing. Similar to Nazi Germany having tacit American support, while also being a puppet state across the Atlantic, for 4 years numerous Americans in high positions and obscure solemnly harbored the conviction that World War II was the wrong war against the wrong enemies. Communism, they knew, was the only genuine adversary on America's historical agenda. Was that not why Hitler had been ignored, tolerated, appeased, aided, so that the Nazi war machine would turn east and wipe Bolshevism off the face of the earth, once and for all? It was just unfortunate that Adolf turned out to be such a megalomaniac and turned west as well. Unquote. William Blum's Killing Hope, U.S. Military and CIA Intervention Since World War II. And footnote number 3, regarding Philosophy Tube's own betrayal of the Palestinians. A.k.a. Abigail Thorne, another liberal Zionist, who explains in her video, and I'm sure some of you will be drawing parallels between the process that the United States went through with the American Indians, aka genocide, and the process Israel has gone through with the Palestinians since it was founded in 1948. Illegal settlements, crimes by settlers tolerated by government, American presidents saying they just want to move in and take over the land. Our question for today is, why is America the way that it is? And today in America, many people are protesting the actions of the Israeli government. You may have heard people describe Israel as a settler colonial state, quoted in Quarantine Collective's Why I'm Done with Philosophy Tube. What the fuck, air quotes, fuck you. Like when Thorne is going to great lengths to gaslight her audience, i.e. to ignore history in favor of past American abuses, including those that foreign nations like Nazi Germany and Israel have followed to a T. None of this is new, but it is discouraged by the mainstream media apparatus that Thorne and Wynne are sucking desperately on the teat of. They're token traitors through and through, making trans people look bad by punching down, i.e. not just at Palestinians, but also Americans protesting Palestinian genocide, which we don't want to add to, i.e. by using slurs that target said protesters, Bad Empanada. Also, tokenism isn't a mental illness, but a criminogenic effect of state force. Furthermore, this current history is old history repeating itself, i.e. historical materialism being history as predicated on material conditions, including various denials of state functions that left-leaning historians like Zinn and Parenti have talked about for decades. Most people are never exposed to real history. In school, we usually don't even read history. We read history textbooks, mainstream ones that avoid the underlying reality and propagate all sorts of myths that serve the powers that be, quoted in Non-Compete's The Dark Truth About America's Founding Fathers. America is the OG den of fascism that inspired the likes of fascist Italy and Nazi Germany. So does pacifism become trafficking with the enemy, but also intellectualism and a complete understanding of history, things to replace, i.e. with badly cited and studied revisionism, typically authored by traders like Wynne and Thorne. Capital gentrifies and decays. Both are gentrified, dropping their masks to decay before our very eyes. That being said, similar myths that aid in their division include the ancient myth of Narcissus, misapplied through modern myths about mental illness in queer people, re. To Win by Bad Empanada, a bigot with an axe to grind, and whose meat-axe approach often has collateral damage. You don't prevent bigotry by being bigoted. Given all the information available, Wynne's actions stop at nothing short of genocide denial, with a giant double standard below. An incredibly disappointing state of affairs, but also one that shouldn't surprise anyone. R.E. Wynne sucks, and has for a long time. Liberals are against every war but the one they're in right now, and every struggle but the one happening right now. They're projecting onto their critics every statement a confession. We'll get to that too. First, I'd like to acknowledge how calling her a narcissist doesn't help, i.e., it's a medical slur with ableist connotations and usage that damage any arguments critiquing Wynne, R.E., which Bad Empanada does to his own response. His post-colonial argument is solid on its face, doesn't need ableism to get its point across, but he uses the slur anyways. Ironically enough, doing so demonstrates a sense of superiority from Bad Empanada that, while justified in his want to feel angry at Wynne, shouldn't explain away or apologize for using a slur like he does. A slur is a slur by virtue of context. In doing so, he conflates what should be rather simple. Wynne is a traitor and should be condemned as one, but Bad Empanada drags mental illness into it, specifically by using ableist language. Not only does said language not apply to Wynne, or explain her behavior in any convincing way, making it feel tacked on, it also promotes negative stereotypes against people with mental disorders, throws trans people more broadly into a bad light. Look at that crazy asshole trans woman. I.e. Bad Empanada, a straight white man, is critiquing a trans woman with all his usual lack of grace, shooting himself in the foot as a result, and other people too. Like, just call her a token, self-centered, white-collar abuser, dude, or call her out for her playing defense for the Clintons' pedophilia, which is valid. Contrapoints allies with him. The problem is, abuser equals asshole, and asshole is synonymous in common parlance with narcissist. Empanadas feeding into various moral panics through bigoted, imprecise language. Let's unpack that. First, mental disorders can be abusive, aka malignant, but these are two different things that don't automatically overlap, i.e. they're modular, and that's important to recognize, which people in moral panics don't tend to do. Someone can have a particular disorder without being an abuser, and the congenital and comorbid factors at play shouldn't be reduced to the usage of slurs. Slurs aren't criticism, but demonization, and ableist slurs demonize mental illness, often applied to trans women, among other GNC groups, or calling Wynne narcissist, will more than likely harm other trans women and mentally ill people, not Wynne, i.e. for being what the Nazis called useless eaters. To it, Bad Empanada could easily critique Wynne's token moderacy and subsequent abusive tendencies without demonizing people with mental disorders, but chooses to ignore this danger and use the word narcissism in a slur-like way. He's panicking in such a way as to use language that feeds into harmful stereotypes that, when used like he does, don't help his argument. They just make him seem bigoted when he could easily avoid that. He's weakening his position while showing that moral panics aren't limited to people on the right. This is called infighting, which, when extended to outgroups, is marginalized infighting. Infighting weakens resistance by dividing it. Why give the powers that be and their proponents ammunition? Regarding footnote 4, Bad Empanada is not marginalized. He's a white cishet man from Australia, with some Greek ancestry if memory serves, but that still doesn't excuse bigotry from him, i.e. a bigotry for one is a bigotry for all, and bigotries overlap. All this being said, it is possible to use narcissism in a clinical way. Theremin Trees, for example, offers a clinical explanation of malignant cluster B personality types: antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic, each with signature behaviors, dramatic, emotional, unpredictable, and manipulative, in which the author, a practicing therapist, explains the behaviors can become intensely destructive both to the disordered individual and those around them, and how narcissism refers to exaggerated ideas of superiority, specialness, and entitlement. They add, in practice, the clinical pictures for these disorders are complex, and the distinctions between them aren't necessarily clear-cut. At the extreme end, there can be vast areas of trait overlap. In regards to theremin trees offering a clinical explanation, I go on to add, or at least clinical sounding. To it, I received some criticism from this portion of my essay that I'd like to include, which I'll present here as a conversation, i.e., as it actually occurred. Christian, the atheist, with respect to these excerpts specifically, but citing theremin trees in general, it is my understanding that there is no such thing as an abusive disorder. There is no such thing as a malignant disorder. There is no such thing as malignant cluster Bs. In the video you cited, the YouTuber does say that phrase, malignant cluster B, but it appears he is just using the term malignant as a flavorful adjective, and I can't find any evidence anywhere that he ever was a therapist, so he is already a dubious source at best. The phrase I believe you are thinking of is malignant narcissist, which is a term with medical application, but it does not in any way inform that the patient is inherently abusive. They may be at a higher risk for patterns of abuse in relationships or more susceptible to episodes of psychosis, but there is no such thing as an abusive mental disorder. I shared a YouTuber who is a licensed psychologist and narcissist personality disorder specialist, as well as, more importantly, an advocate for people with narcissist personality disorder. Here is his explanation of malignant narcissism. Again, I genuinely appreciate you standing up for us. I hope this criticism doesn't come off as anything personal. Personally, I think you're awesome for caring. Not at all. Honestly, this is useful info, and actually helps reinforce what I was thinking about regarding theremin in particular. His channel focuses on abuse manipulation from what I gleaned, not mental health. Sure, though the two aren't mutually exclusive. I would clarify that abuser status and disorder are not the same thing, but that people with mental disorders can be abusive in ways that some people describe as malignant, medically or not. I appreciate the added perspective. One of my partners has narcissistic personality disorder, and I've dated people with others, e.g. borderline, re. kuwu. The idea I wanted to argue isn't there is anything malignant about these disorders inherently, but how they can lead to abuse more likely than non-disordered persons. But I appreciate the added clarity about malignant. As a medical term, I've heard it used before, but ironically and non-medically by Rush, i.e., in their song of that very name, while riffing off 2004's Team America World Police. So, from a place of parody, actively ridiculing another parody of American foreign policy and liberal politics during the War on Terror and Islamophobia. So, I think my problem with theremin and others is that if you are discussing a cluster B personality disorder, it is harmful to describe the traits and behaviors without putting the emphasis on what actually makes it a disorder, the suffering. Again, my perception is highly polarized, so I don't get to just like or dislike someone. I have to idealize or devalue, and then try to establish a baseline from that. But that's where my head is at on it, I think. This video might also be pertinent since you bring up moral panic in your essay. Maybe not applicable here, but definitely good info. That's fair. You're also approaching it as a person with the disorder, so your perspective is actually incredibly important in that respect. As for myself, I have survived abusers who have had different disorders, but I always try to acknowledge my survival being of their abuse and not their disorder, if that makes any sense. I was in denial about the abuse I endured for most of my life. I never thought of myself as a survivor because I thought my violent upbringing was normal. It's a strange thing to discover decades later. I have no cognitive resentment towards my parents, but I still have psychotic episodes because of the way my nervous system responds to them. The body remembers, as they say. I'm really sorry you and I had to survive when we deserved to thrive, but I'm glad we did. The takeaway here is that it's important to acknowledge the perils in citing any source on its face, including YouTube videos, but also academic material and widespread language, with potential misconceptions baked in. Don't be afraid to question or critique anything you come across when using it to inform and shape your own arguments, a process known in academic circles as synthesis, and one whose application is ongoing. Pushback is valuable, provided it stays constructive and conducive towards development and harm reduction while reversing abjection, which the above conversation certainly did, I think. i.e., people with mental disorders aren't alien, but are viewed as alien in ways they like to reclaim, e.g. by voicing their concerns, but also describing themselves honestly while seeing themselves as having less of a sickness to purge or cure, and more a condition to live with, understand, and accept, therefore raising awareness and preventing genocide. Advocacy and education go hand in hand, and we owe ourselves to self-educate about the issues and people we're advocating for, directly from the source, i.e., people who live with conditions are going to have resources immediately on hand towards dealing with them, surviving them, but also people who have been taught to think such things are alien, thus prone to simply attack them on sight or label them for attack, re. Bad Empanada. Furthermore, diverging perspectives are useful, i.e. towards a holistic understanding of abuse being two-sided, re. as I write about in Healing from Rape, with Kuo and I bonding through our respective abuse from different vantage points, to find healing together from rape, the process occurring through media as a vector to relate to and with, back and forth, between people and media, on stage and off. From Volume 1, quote, at its most basic level, rape is a violation of basic human, animal, and environmental rights enacted through Cartesian power abuse. This postscript concerns the complicated process that healing from rape entails, i.e., its corrupting presence through codified trauma, wherein the surviving of police abuse becomes something to relate to others through Gothic stories that constitute radical empathy as a thing forever out of joint, the attempt to emphasize with alien experiences to gain new perspective. Such empathy needn't concern both parties equally, and its Gothic dialogues concern intense, poetic liminalities still bearing an intense potential for disguise that is haunted by the shadow of police forces, i.e., it is where little Gothic BDSM may camp trauma, doing so through cryptonomy as pushing towards what it cannot always achieve. Kuwu was one of my exes, and the sole one living with rape trauma of a sexual nature. As stated earlier in Volume 1 and in Volume 0, our relationship was far from perfect. Even so, listening to them about their trauma still changed how I felt about older media, hence the world. When Kuwu and I watched Ninja Scroll, for instance, I knew I was sharing a movie that I had watched for years, had grown up on, in fact. However, I didn't realize until after how limited and stuck my point of view was. With it, I had never noticed the deeper nuances of the film's rapacious violence, which could only be seen from a different, ultimately asexual point of view. Being different, but also no stranger to rape, Kuwu noticed them immediately. As we watched the movie, I gave Kuwu trigger warnings for the upcoming rape scenes, for which they thanked me. Those bothered them far more than the manly violence did, the rape making them go blank and dissociate. After the film was over, we talked about it from Kuwu's point of view, as someone I related to in both sexual and asexual ways. Doing so, frankly, opened my eyes to what, for them, was an everyday experience, living with the trauma and threat of rape as something for you and others to behold, often as voyeurs, but also as BDSM practitioners, fetishizing our own survival, specifically our survived abuse, and psychosexual Gothic forms. Many of the fantasies that Kuwu and I played out reflected the sorts of unspoken abuses generally granted some kind of voice in Gothic fictions. My relationship with Kuwu did not last, but they did teach me lasting lessons about how to perform, play with, and exchange stories of psychosexual trauma through Gothic poetics and Little Gothic BDSM. The takeaway moral with Kuwu and Ninja Scroll, and the Terminator and similar Gothic stories, is that it is tremendously important to learn from more disadvantaged groups when you occupy a dominant position, even if we have lived through trauma ourselves, and regularly consume voyeuristic apparel." Unquote. But Theremin Tree's usage denotes a clinical approach to the term, which they handle with care. Ari ostensibly is a working pro, or at least someone intent on educating to prevent harm through language geared towards that purpose. Bad Empanada does not, falling into the same trap that many critics of abusers historically do, using a slur to diagnose their targets, describing them in ways that confuse what abuse is and where it is found, and generally at the expense of marginalized communities. Abusers and people with mental disorders are not one and the same. And any critique worth its salt should distinguish between the two, not confuse them. And if Wynne is abusive and narcissistic, that distinction should also be made, emphasis placed on discouraging her abusive actions versus demonizing her for her alleged mental condition, an action, I would add, that Bad Empanada makes alongside his own history of moderate transphobia and veiled Stalinist arguments. In short, it's important to check our own bigotries because they can bleed into and inform the opinions of others, but especially in the internet age, where anyone can make a video decrying someone as narcissist, i.e. in ways that prohibit the medical usage of the word, leading to people with the actual medical condition to hide, dissociate from, or fawn for their otherwise valid circumstances. Slurs induce ignorance and apologia for harm, generally by scapegoating or attaching slurs to people as a group versus an individual, i.e. the usage of slurs won't stop at Wynne, and never should have started with her to begin with. Furthermore, the usage of ableist slurs are often not seen as slurs for their medical nature, i.e. despite their medical misuse by non-practicing individuals. This can compound regarding genocide and moral panics. As things worsen in Palestine, the usage of slurs can lead to a harmful desire, i.e. to seek out blame and brand people as narcissists, or to associate those who recognize their own mental disorder with those who were wrongfully labeled to begin with. Things confuse, the abuser and the patient conflating during various moral panics and genocides that, through the mechanisms of the state, rely on such destabilization, able-bodied bias, and infighting to divide and conquer workers like usual. Slurs do nothing but harm, so don't use them. Ari, just call Wynne a traitor or abuser and you're golden. All the same, these slurs and their arguments don't come out of nowhere. They're taught, often criminogenically. There is a mythological component within literary analysis, for example, one that speaks to the understanding of narcissistic behavior as a teaching device, e.g. Narcissist Eve in Paradise Lost, and the various usages afforded by narcissism under this particular context. Quote, "The correlation between creation and procreation illustrates the refractive nature of reproduction. A child is an imperfect reflection of the parent through genetic and environmental influences, yet the parent sees himself within his offspring. By identifying his children as images of himself, God's intentional reproduction of this likeness illustrates a narcissistic process of self-replication disguised as procreation. The visual resemblance of Adam and Eve to their creator further exemplifies the narcissism embedded within the act of reproduction. The text describes Adam and Eve as godlike, and the image of their glorious maker, thereby depicting them as perfectly formed, visual reflections of their creator. Here, the child's visual resemblance to the parent implies God's tendency for self-reflexivity, because as the parent, God quite literally sees a likeness of himself when he looks upon his offspring. The pleasure gained by looking upon his own creations is reminiscent to Eve's story of her creation, which evokes the myth of Narcissus. Like Narcissus, Eve becomes enamored with her own reflection, pining with vain desire as she looks at the surface of a smooth lake. Her reflection is a source of fascination for her, though it is an innocent interest given that she, like Narcissus, is unaware that it is her own image. Comparatively, God's interest in Adam and Eve is much more self-interested, for in his intentional active imitation, their divine creation and his image reveals an awareness of his own superiority as the deity supreme. His conscious replication of himself to balance the destruction caused by rebel angels suggests that divine creation is innately narcissistic. To reproduce beings in the image of their glorious maker, to acknowledge that his own form and creative capacity is best suited to restore goodness to the world." Unquote. Source: Rebecca Dillon's An Analysis of Creative Narcissism within John Milton's Paradise Lost. Here, narcissism has many different applications, not all of them bad, i.e., despite being written by a bigoted poet, Paradise Lost remains a useful gateway in critiquing state power while siding with state enemies. Also, I use Paradise Lost precisely because of its hyper-canonical state, meaning to such a degree as to supersede many people's understanding, thus recognition of the Bible, regardless if they've read either, e.g. calling Satan Lucifer, which largely stems from Milton's work, not the Bible. Examining Milton's admittedly problematic text through a particular lens, Eve is no more a villain in women's eyes than Satan is in British Romantic ones. From my PhD's Notes on Power, Essay 2023. Quote, because of its allegory as having such awesome revolutionary potential, Milton was described by William Blake as being of the devil's party and not knowing it. Or, as Jamal Subi Ismail Nafi writes in Milton's portrayal of Satan in Paradise Lost on the notion of heroism, according to Textski Gordon, it was Blake who expressed this view most emphatically by saying that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. He expressed this opinion chiefly in relation to the portrayal of Satan, who, according to him, has been depicted as a character possessing certain grand qualities worthy of the highest admiration. Other Romantic critics supported this view with great enthusiasm. Percy Shelley, for instance, reinforced this view when, in his defense of poetry, he said, nothing can exceed the energy and magnificence of the character of Satan as expressed in Paradise Lost. It is a mistake to suppose that he could ever have been intended for the popular personification of evil. Milton's devil as a moral being is as far superior to God as one who perseveres in some purpose which he has conceived to be excellent in spite of adversity and torture, is to one who in the cold security of undoubted triumph inflicts the most horrible revenge upon his enemy. According to Shelley, it was a mistake to think that Satan was intended by Milton as the popular personification of evil. This argument is still very much alive and valid today. Unquote. The takeaway is teaching, and my focus is on bigotry as something to avoid in any context. Slurs and arguments that use them on purpose or not, mid-panic, do not emerge ex nihilo. Stereotypes spring from popular media, but also arguments about media that are classically misunderstood or appropriated, e.g. Satan is, in the Bible and later in Milton's work, which unto itself yields sexist implications, meaning towards Eve and its author's imperfect critique of the devil, original sin, and political uprising that went on to inform Mary Shelley's 1818 Frankenstein and many other works that followed, i.e., us versus them, abjection, where in-groups and out-groups alienate each other using bigoted language with overtly fantastical but also medicalized flavors that have become dead in terms of those original functions, to serve a classically ostracizing flavor useful to capital. People who speak out are banished. Banishment the entire problem faced by the left, and caused as much among themselves lacking tactical unity and intersectional solidarity as through direct divisions sown by the right. A good show of faith, thus solidarity and unity, is consciously avoiding these slurs during genocide and whichever moral panics are inflamed at the time. Regarding the conscious avoiding of slurs, footnote number 5, even if we think that people might intuit we're using medical terms in a mythical sense, wherein we should stress a mythical usage, or a comedic one, which is still problematic, e.g. Steve Martin dropping the hard R in The Jerk while posturing as a black man despite his white skin, a white savior. But people who rely on ambiguous language loosely to generate harm are historically not careful about it. We're all victims under capital, but have to bond with others without using slurs, e.g. Dirty Harry using slurs against his non-white partners and victims alike. i.e. bullets are often delivered behind bigoted language, a language that works like bullets. The intent is to cause harm, which adds up. We need to take it seriously and acknowledge the oppression of others through our own, without trivializing or weaponizing theirs. And if doing so feels confusing, then good, that's the point. Bigotry is something to confuse, out of its own harmful modes of thought. Regarding the intuition of medical terms being used in a mythical sense, The idea isn't really any different than dismissing someone for talking crazy, the classic fate of women in history and stories by men. In Gothic, words like crazy or madness aren't medical diagnoses any more than narcissist is, but spoken written means of dismissal tied to alienation first and foremost, i.e. the Cassandra complex, aka ignoring the oracle, or in Gothic, the girl who cried ghost. Think Scooby-Doo, e.g. Emily St. Aubert versus Ludovico in The Mysteries of Udolpho, debating about ghosts being in the other room when actually it's pirates. Emily was wrong about the presence being actual ghosts, but not about a feeling of danger occupying the room, which Ludovico, the man in this scenario, was wrong about, i.e. rationality versus irrationality having a classic gender component out of ancient times into the present. In Wynn's case, she's no oracle, and yet Bad Empanada's language is precisely the smug, knowing better sort that would be used to dismiss people who are oracles, i.e. marginalized voices trying to communicate oppression to people used to getting their own way, white straight men. You're stupid because I say you're stupid. It's not factual, but forceful. Granted, there can always be a case for where a given word certainly fits, or where force is called for, but defaulting to force is a bad habit prone to misconception. In Wynn's case, for example, she's not crazy any more than the Nazis were. She knows exactly what she's doing. Better to address the banality of evil, acting out of material self-interest, than confuse things by framing her as stupid or insane, then hoping people get it, i.e. by virtue of how forcefully you say it versus how accurate your statement is. Striving for accuracy is better than habitually being forceful and inaccurate, thus depending on luck, because accuracy avoids the inaccurate force, thus collateral damage that slurs are known for, re. the objection process. They lead to finger-pointing that misses the point, e.g. you're stupid versus you're betraying workers. It's a question of thesis, and communicating said thesis through praxis by cultivating good habits, i.e. that get our point across without harming other people, directly or otherwise. I digress. The point being that us versus them argument can be used, however accidentally or on purpose, to divide people of different marginalities by themselves and their allies. Hence, an awareness towards the different usages of terms like narcissism involves knowing the context in ways that prevent such division, thus genocide, while knowing all of the uses a word could serve, i.e. that renders them a slur, medical term, or reclamatory device depending. Generally, a slur is reclaimed from its abusive usage by a demonized outgroup member, bullied or otherwise insulted by in-group members, and which medical terms can assist in, e.g. homosexual and gay panic, versus queer people calling themselves faggot for ironic purposes, similar to people of color reclaiming the N-word to empower themselves, or whatever people with mental disorders use. Unreclaimed slurs are not ironic, they're harmful, and generally to varying degrees of ignorance and misuse. To address that ignorance, it behooves us to understand the exact history of moral panic and misuse surrounding narcissism. Sarah Z's The Narcissist Scare remains a good place to start. To be clear, we need to excoriate Wynn for her bad faith activism, but not let fear and superstition feed into the very pogroms happening at home and abroad, i.e. to prevent making our own activism bigoted like hers, with Bad Empanada having his own bigotries to address. Token abusers like her and Philosophy Tube need to be outed and exposed for what they are, not what they aren't. And to do that, workers must unite. Allies to trans people must unite with trans people against all abusers, as well as trans people of different amounts of privilege and oppression coming together to help others under the imperial boot. E.g., Essence of Thoughts, Dear white trans people, Palestinians are not your enemy. American and Western, re. Bad Empanada, workers must stand with their fellow oppressed, using intersectional solidarity to out abusers like Wynn, but also any abuse that occurs when criticizing her betrayal, re. Bad Empanada, and push towards universal liberation, i.e. without resorting to slurs used by those who historically don't experience their original, intentionally harmful effects, with Bad Empanada neither being disabled nor trans. To be transparent and practice what I preach, I want to affirm my stances on Wynn, Palestine, and Bad Empanada. First, I've critiqued Wynn for years, including more recently in 2024 with an essay on Jordan Peele's Us. Quote, Peele is commenting on the historical material confusions that do arise during class war of a racialized neoliberal character. I, on the other hand, am already dead like Matheson's commie zombie vampires. I don't pretend to be something I'm not. Wynne is legend in that respect. The fabled merchant of Venice, something to assimilate and imitate capital while playing the rebel. Sometimes her mask slips. Others, its slippage is literally her costume. Someone from management clearly got to Wynne along the way, souring her rebellious facade into a joke of itself. By flaunting her wealth and playing the victim, Wynne is blurring the line between herself and her character as part of her brand. Natalie Wynne, Marie Antoinette, Contrapoints. She's having her cake and eating it too, is pinkwashing class war to claim herself the token trans victim, i.e. speaking about her own class betrayal through Peel's story as something to weaponize against impolite rebels. You know, us actual communists, and not whatever the fuck she's calling herself these days. She thinks she's the merchant of Venice, the Portia to castrate men mid-exchange. Bitch, please, your victory is antiquated and overshadowed by my trans rebellion actually having teeth for capital as the ones to bite. Unquote. But also, in a 2022 essay, which I republished in my 2025 book, RE Volume 3, from my sex positivity series, Trans TERFs, NERFs, and Queer Bosses. Queer bosses are moderately conservative in relation to their own trauma, gender-critical condescension, and reactionary violence. They are privileged queer persons who, once token, use gender-critical rhetoric against people marginalized differently than themselves, which turns into prison hierarchy of the abuser acting more marginalized during vengeful, but also sanctimonious Darvo tactics. We'll explore so now featuring Natalie Wynne, aka Contrapoints, not always trans but always centrist, meaning they were in the closet at one point in time. People like Wynne usually attack non-binary people while acting better than out-and-out TERFs. Their trauma, thus casus belli, is legitimate when deputized by the state into its monopoly on legitimate violence. Since non-binary people often identify as trans, this makes binary trans ambiphobes specialized TERFs. NERFs? Whatever you call it, that's what Wynne is. A token cop in disguise, therefore traitor, whitewashing fellow fascists with moderate veneers, e.g. whitewashing Hillary fucking Clinton through transcriptonomy glitz, bandied about by a token sockdem. And this image specifically is one that I added to the essay when republishing it. Unquote. Second, I've stood with Palestine my entire life into my postgrad work. Justice for Palestine, October 13th, 2023, Bushnell's Requiem, An Ode to a Martyr, February 29th, 2024, Judas Priest, Invincible Shield and Zionism, March 8th, 2024, On Anti-Semitism versus Anti-Semitism, December 31st, 2024. Third, I've also critiqued Bad Empanada for being transphobic, and now it would appear ableist, and not just for myself, i.e. many of my friends are trans, disabled, and mentally ill to varying degrees, including having different personality disorders. To conclude, the situation in Palestine is black and white, meaning super simple, re. Michael Brooks, i.e. despite what people like Natalie Wynne and Abigail Thorne like to say. It's also incredibly dire, but shouldn't be an excuse to infight or muddy the waters, i.e. regarding parallel struggles for liberation, educating people, meaning in such a way as to avoid all bigotries through language as the vector by critiquing critics, no matter how low the fruit they're needling hangs. Re. Narcissism is still a slur, and Bad Empanada is still a bigot, re. a transphobe and ableist, regardless how good of a post-colonialist Empanada thinks he is, or awful Contrapoints actually is. It's bad practice to use slurs to make your point, an attitude likely stemming from your own hubris and unwillingness to think critically about popular media, but also people more/differently disadvantaged than you are. We need to rewire that, which takes time and conscious effort, i.e. to overcome an ancient problem, communicating effectively in times of state abuse, pitting workers against each other in all the usual ways, e.g. men versus women, reason versus a perceived lack of reason. See final footnote. Don't comport, do. So don't just think because you're smart, Empanada, which you are, that you automatically know more or better than trans and or disabled people, but also artists and academics, which leads you to say some really stupid shit, i.e. with all the confidence taught arrogance and privilege affords, re. the epigram. Slurs aren't activism, and cruelty isn't a virtue. All that glitters is not gold, and you're a Philistine, one with a bigot stick jammed up his ass, and which I've critiqued at length before, re. Understanding Vampires, 2024, and someone who enjoys the typical savior status generally upheld through force, calling itself reason, i.e. to enjoy all the usual privilege that you, Bad Empanada, have, as a perceived man of reason acting exempt from criticism, RA for being white, straight, male, from Australia, etc. Success can go to your head like anyone's. Might makes right, leading to all the usual shortcuts, cramming a square peg into a round hole. What starts with words classically ends in hatred, violence, murder, and excuses, which genocide, as a structure, ultimately is. Don't contribute to it, no matter how small you think your contributions are. Trans and disabled persons aren't historically colonizers, but victims. The mind is its own place, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. Learn from your mistakes to liberate all workers at once. No slurs, save under ironic circumstances. Just unity against all divisive factors that capital encourages to perpetuate genocide. The trick in thwarting genocide and moral panic is seeing ourselves as human by not using slurs. RE, capitalism has no use for people who see each other as human. It wants us dehumanizing ourselves so capital can function as normal, moving money through nature at the cost of human life. So that concludes my essay on Natalie Wynn, but also people like Bad Empanada using the narcissist slur to inaccurately describe Wynn. If you like the essay, you can support my work financially on Ko-Fi or Patreon. Either helps. You can also like, share, and subscribe. That helps as well. And you can also leave comments in the comment section of my video. I respond to them. I also am willing to take criticism. I'm willing to interview people. And I'm always interested in learning about new things to write about in times of crisis where we can help each other reach a collective understanding that prevents all genocides simultaneously. Helping the Palestinians, helping trans people, people of color, religious minorities at home, abroad, people in the global south, gender nonconforming people more broadly, religious minorities more broadly, indigenous people, and so on and so forth. So feedback helps. It leads me to write new things, and hopefully you found it educational and interesting, and hopefully it teaches you a little bit about something that is commonly misunderstood, like narcissism, or for that matter, trans people. In any event, thank you for listening, and until next time, take care, stay safe, and good luck.